Anthony Barrese is artistic director and principal conductor of Opera Southwest, bringing Wagner's Lohengrin for 2 performances in March to Visu Cleveland High School in Rio Rancho. Welcome.
Hey.
So first, let's talk about Wagner.
Okay.
The plot of this is magic. It's the knight in shining armor.
Yeah, Knight of the Grail. Yep.
A witch who ends up dying in the end, a kidnapped kid, an innocent damsel wrongly accused.
Right, yeah.
But relatively simple in terms of what happens, yet he makes a 3-hour opera out of it.
The reason, I believe the reason that Wagner's operas are so long is because he insisted on being the poet also of the librettos. And the librettos were always the first thing he wrote. And he was not a particularly skilled, literary, mind. And it was very overblown and very overripe and really overwrought in his poetry. And so he would write this huge, epic poem, and then he had to set it to music. So there's so many words to get through that, and he didn't cut any. He was not a very good editor as far as the text, because he thought, the music has to come from the text, and since the text is this gigantic thing, I have to stick with it now. I mean, he did some alterations, but the length is really because the poetry is just so darn long.
Is there something about the emotional impact when you get to the end of the piece that is also amplified by the amount of time of what you've been through? I
mean, I think so. Especially in some of the later works, there's a real payoff at the very end. I mean, Lohengrin, especially the Lohengrin that we're doing, is trimmed down enough that I don't think it will seem excessively long. We have it down to just about 3 hours, which is what an opera audience is expecting to go into when they do it. So I don't think this will feel any longer than a lot of, like the Norma, for example. But yes, when some of the longer pieces where it's 5 hours or 5+ hours plus a dinner in the middle, then by the end there's this like a marathon, like that you've made it through to the other end.
Well, and obviously Wagner has a devoted following, and there is some reason for that because the music is so impactful.
And there's nobody, there was no one like, there's nothing like him before him. There are people that he was obviously influenced by, but he just stands out above and beyond anybody else at the time, in especially in Germany with opera, and it's just astonishing how this is like one person came up with all of this stuff. I mean, the amount of thinking outside the box in every measure is incredible.
And among the influences of his was sort of the sung through aspect of it, where it's not really aria recit or aria orchestral. It's one massive piece of music. Talk about his use of leitmotif.
Well, it's not as developed here. I mean, there are a couple motives that that are associated that you hear. This one's kind of with Lohengrin, and this one. It's more key structure at this point, and more tonality. It's not as there are a couple leitmotifs, but they don't start really intertwining in on each other the way that they eventually do. They're just sort of like, this motive is this character, this motive is this character. Whereas in later works, the motives start to really cross over in a very sophisticated psychological way that he had not really reached yet. I mean, in many ways, even though this is a through composed opera, this is still a very traditional opera. He doesn't call it arias and duets and ensembles, but that's exactly what happens. In fact, the end of Act 1 is a gigantic ensemble for everybody, just the way you would see at the end of an act of an Italian opera. And so in many ways it does still function like a traditional opera, even though these norms are bursting at the seams at this point. For the singers, is it already the full Wagnerian challenge? No, not even close. In fact, I talk about this in the program notes for this. The idea of a Wagnerian singer did not exist in his time. And if you look at the premier cast for the first Lohengrin, they were all of them under 30, except for the Lohengrin. The Ortrud, and Ortrud is one of the most brutal, punishing roles in the Metz repertoire. She was 18 years old. So the idea of what is a Wagner singer was certainly not developed back then, and even now these are very lyrical roles. I mean, Lohengrin is for example much easier to sing than the tenor role in Manon Lescaut or the tenor role in Turandot. I mean, it's much more lyrical. It's not as shouty. This is not as big of an orchestra as we come to eventually associate with Wagner. It's in some ways sort of a chamber orchestra for him. I mean, it's not a chamber orchestra, but So really, the tessitura, the how high they sing is not as high, and it's way more lyrical and much less declamatory and shouty. In many ways, very Italianate.
Let's talk about the venue you're going to. There was damage to the National Hispanic Cultural Center, but it's like an unknown gem. The Visu Cleveland Concert Hall is an incredible concert hall designed to be an acoustic concert hall space, not as a multi-purpose venue. So acoustically, it's going to be a gorgeous setting.
It's incredible. I just walked in there for the first time this morning, and just hearing footsteps in there is magical. It just sounds beautiful. It sounds like a state-of-the-art. It reminds me of Jordan Hall in Boston, and on a smaller scale, like Symphony Center in Chicago. But it is a beautifully, wonderfully constructed acoustic, and we're gonna, and the singers will be in costume. There will be some staging. We're looking into the idea of projection, so we're gonna still try to keep this as much of an opera as we can possibly in that space. But the good news is that musically, the orchestra, the chorus, the singers are really going to have the most advantageous possibility.
And it still retains the intimacy of a relatively small concert hall. You're right on top of the stage.
It's more. It's quite a few more seats than we have at the NHCC, but it is constructed in such a way that it's not like Popejoy where it just goes back and back and back and back. It is very. I think you're right. I think it will still feel very intimate.